Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Friends, when India became independent, soon after India became independent, there were many doubts cast about as to whether India will actually, remain a nation, because many people thought that India's caste and caste society, India's cultural, diversities and religious conflicts, especially after the partition riots. Many Western scholars were almost dismissive of India's prospects of cohering as a nation, because we are not only diverse in terms of our cultures, but also we had, even our linguistically, in terms of language also, there was considerable variety. Therefore, many scholars, especially many political scientists, said that India is facing the dangerous decades. India may break up into separate provinces, separate states. That's what they feared. But isn't it remarkable that from those days of dangerous decades, we have moved to the days of, well, one can say from dangerous decades, comments. Now people are, they're not actually saying this. Now, Shining India, this was a slogan used by the Vajpayee government when it, Shining India after, right? So this, in the 2009 elections, of course, the Vajpayee government, was defeated because India was not shining enough for the people of the country. We needed more. We needed to do more, much more. I think even this is a positive sign. Is a positive indication that India has matured as a nation. Now, how do we explain this remarkable progress this remarkable progress? How can we say that what are the factors that contributed to the consolidation of India as a nation? This is very important as a nation state. This is very important because if you look at the example of some of the neighboring countries, their democracy, their nations were in a state of, there have been, the nations have broken apart, they're split into two, and there's been considerable turmoil, and even today, some of these nations, some of these countries have had to face direct or indirect military rule. Having said that, that's why, of course, Pakistan shares our culture. But how come, Pakistan still has to be indirectly controlled by the military, and its democracy is still a bit shaky as compared to India? I think for that, one of the main reasons is that we established, we are deliberately adopted democratic pattern of governance. And not only that, we established institutions which supported democratic processes. This I need to elaborate slightly, because democracy also, the point, the beauty of the Indian Constitution is that it not only established these democratic institutions, legislature, the the state consisting of the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, and so on. But the democratic institutions had an inbuilt tendency, the way they worked, the democracy worked, had an inbuilt tendency to reinforce and strengthen these democratic institutions. How this has happened? First of all, I think we should, there is no, however much, we cannot just underplay the importance of universal adult franchise that the Constitution adopted. Universal adult franchise is that it gave vote to every adult in the country, irrespective of his educational status or this, or gender. Women also had the right to vote, and whether irrespective of caste, gender, class, everyone had got the right to vote. This was this was indeed revolutionary, because even in the more mature democracies, women's right to vote was recognized much later. The suffragette movement in England took place in the early 19th century, and and women had to fight for their right to vote. So was it the case in America. Women did not get their right to vote automatically. They had to fight for it. This did not happen in India. This is remarkable, because it was this vote is not only Dr. Ambedkar, he had made a comment that we have entered an era of one man, one vote. He should have also included one woman, one vote. But the point is that he felt that one man, one vote would not deliver one man, one value. And then he wanted this to be restored. But the point is, the very fact that you have, incorporated the principle of one man, one vote, will move towards, gave the impetus for the system to move towards one man, one value. This is this giving voting right itself carries with it the right to right to equality. This is a significant point. That the point is that it may appear that is just an administrative decision taken in in a high-spirited moment, but if you look at it seriously, it's a decision which has had long-lasting effects on the way democracy has progressed in our country. This is one. And then there is, this is very important. And then the federal structure, with all its defects, federal structure of our democracy, all right, is another important milestone. It is an important feature that ensured that the country's nation, just as universal adult franchise, federal structure also contributed to the integrative process that was so essential for our nation building. Well, I should also mention here that even as we say that, it is now very clear that our nation building exercise has succeeded. Of course, there are several dangers, especially now during, in this age of, in this global age, we are facing new threats to our nation building. But yet, on the, we can, if we look back, we don't have to be smug. We can't afford to be smug, but we can certainly, feel satisfied that our nation building, nation building efforts have yielded substantial results. At the same time, even as we compliment ourselves for our efforts, for our nation building, for our success in nation building, we should also, be aware of the way we had to overcome some of the obstacles that came in the way of India becoming a becoming a nation state. You all know that in the former Tamil Nadu, that is former Madras presidency, there was this Dravida Kalaga movement. And this movement preached separation from India. It preached the ideology of Dravidistan. And this separatist movement, soon, in the early 1950s, it folded up because of the very force of democracy. You see, as as democratic processes, took root, even in Tamil Nadu, what happened was that the Tamil Nadu, the leaders realized that they have much to gain by being part of the larger Indian nation than, by remaining outside it. And similarly, there was also the insurrection in the northeast. There was this Kashmiri movement for independence, and then there is also the Naxalite movement. If you look at all these movements, all these subversive movements have been sort of tamed. They have not been completely overcome, but they have been tamed by the power of the vote. Because the Naxalites used to, their slogan was that power grows out of the barrel of the gun. But the power of the vote is so powerful. The vote is so powerful that it can, face the gun, and yet, the people faced the gun and yet went and voted, demonstrating that the weakness of the Naxalite movement, and their inability to make any dent in our nation building efforts. Similarly, the Kashmir, in spite of everything, now Kashmir insurrection has become a very serious, poses a serious problem to the, to India. But even here, what you find is the process of going through the election itself has, has a muting effect on separatist movements. For instance, the Hurriyat Conference, periodically, issue injunctions saying, fatwas saying that, asking people to not vote, but people still go and vote. And that itself shows that democracy generates confidence even in people who are alienated from the state for a variety of reasons. So this is one. This is one of the reasons. The power of the vote vote tends to, by the universal adult franchise, tends to bind the nation. Tends to, acts as a centripetal force in building of the nation. And then you look at another important thing is that now that we have had so many elections, you look at the way our, it's interesting to study the history of Indian elections itself, because if you look at the history of Indian elections, you will see in that in that narrative a history of in India's national integration. Why do I say that? Why do I say that the Indian elections reveal the history of national integration? We look, that's for one reason. You see, the Indian voters have realized now the power of vote. As you see, it's not just that at the election time the powerful politicians come and meet them and come and beg them for vote. But the Indian voters have realized, but the collective effect of their voting will have tremendous repercussions, and that they can change governments. Their heads can roll, and if some of the leaders are not working efficiently, working according to their requirements, they can be replaced by another set of leaders. The recent election is also a very interesting, provides us an interesting case study, because look, there were many states in the country which voted for another party in the elections held, in the elections held just a few months ago, last year. But the same electorate, have voted for another national party when it came to the national level elections to the Lok Sabha. What does this reveal? It reveals that the Indian voter is able to discriminate between the state level elections and the national level elections. Indian voter, she is able to, she knows that what the issues confronting the nation are quite different from the issues confronting the local, the state or the local level politics. Therefore, she votes for one party at the center which she thinks is delivering goods. Similarly, she votes for another party which caters to her caste and community interests when it comes to the state level and the local panchayat level elections. So this power to discriminate. This is also an educative process. Elections have been a mass scale, mass education program in a way, and this itself, this power to discriminate, the fact that they have realized the power of the vote, itself, augurs well for democracy and for nation building, because there is this is also a centripetal force which makes people participate, in the process of nation building. That's a point that we cannot ignore at all. Then the other thing, you see, the political leaders, all right, in the country, parties and political leaders, even there are national parties, and then there are regional parties. Some of the regional parties have power only in their particular states, all right, and and national parties, are represented in most of the states. Now, the point is that national parties are conscious of the national agenda, are conscious of the power that obtains at the center. But how about regional parties? You see, the Indian democracy is such an open democracy that even because of its federal structures, it is possible for even smaller parties to exercise their weight at the national level. All right, and there have been instances in our country of smaller parties, of leaders from smaller parties having become prime ministers. Mr. Devegowda is one of the most glaring examples of one of the most visible examples of such a process. So what happens is that at the national level there is much more prestige and power involved. Vis-a-vis, instead of ruling a small state, you will be, your policies, your power will stretch over so many states. So that is also a big attraction. The very federated structure of our country can also it has also contributed to national integration. This is the same is the case with it's not impossible for Miss Mayawati or for Mamta Di to become the Prime Minister of the country. It is quite probable that they can end up becoming Prime Ministers. That means the power structure, elections make the power structure open even at the national level. So this at the level of political leaders at both the national and at the local state levels, you will find that there is as I said, centripetal. Democracy has itself become a centripetal force in contributing to nation building. Democracy, I was till now talking about democracy's power to contribute to nation building efforts. At the same time, democracy is a structure that also poses impediments in the process of nation building. Not in a way, it is it also creates problems in nation building efforts, because if we consider nation building also requires development. You need to, if you want to hold the country together, you will have to promote development and economic growth. Today development has entered the common vocabulary. All right, and development is very necessary for for consolidation of the nation, of nationalism. What I want to stress here is that development, although it has been a goal of the of all the parties, and it has been a goal of several governments which have come to power at the center, both at the center and at the state level. The way the way democracy works, democracy provides or becomes a speed breaker in the course of development. Why do I say this? Why do I say this? Why do I say that democracy becomes a speed breaker? Because of democratic forces, right from the word, from the beginning, when democracy was introduced, you will find that the government, successive governments have emphasized on egalitarianism. Egalitarianism means it's emphasized equality. As I had said before, equality itself has been interpreted in diverse ways. I will discuss that. You see, equality has became a major consideration, right from the moment that the Indian government started functioning. In the beginning, the government adopted socialist policies. All right, socialism. What's called actually it's called social. It wanted to. Its development program was geared to achieving socialist pattern of society. Through democratic means. Socialist pattern of society in Soviet Union was, attempted to be achieved through totalitarian means. But here, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru said that we are wedded to the ideals of democracy. So, socialist pattern of society has to be adopted. Even here in the beginning, in the early days, when when 5-year plan was being drafted, there was a big debate on how to go about it. Some of the economists felt that we should have development first and then equality, because unless we have development, what will be, we can't have equality, we can't share. The idea of many people offered the example of a cake. Unless you have unless the cake becomes bigger, unless the cake becomes big, you will not be able to cut the cake to feed everyone. First, you should have development, and then you can have equality. But the first 5-year plan itself, one of the objectives of the plan it stated was development with equality. So already equality comes in as a major feature of our development policy, as a major aspect of development policies. The first and the second 5-year plan adopted the goal of economic growth with distributive justice. It adopted the goal of economic growth with distributive justice, and this kind of egalitarian approach was not really based on can be considered a secular approach to equality, because the other considerations of caste, religion were not included. It was, the idea was that the poor classes, the deprived, have to be sort of one has to assure that the fruits of development reach the deprived sections of the community, be it without consideration of caste and religion and so on. That's why I call it secular approach. Now there is subsequently what happened was that this kind of this interpretation of equality took another major turn when it became caste-based equality. That is following Ambedkar's idea of social equality, right? It became equality was to be measured in terms of the castes, in terms of the upward movement of those castes which have so far been oppressed and depressed. Okay, if you look at the notion of socialist pattern of society, what the government wanted to do, socialist, it adopted socialist planning. That is, there is a central authority which decides to use the resources that the country has in a judicious manner and diverts it to essential economic activities to gradually increase productivity and the production and the total production in the country, to increase the GDP, that is gross domestic product, as well as the level of living of the people, which is measured in terms of per capita national income. Now, in order to do this, the government thought we should not fritter away our resources. We should have systematic planning. It brought very, there were very, brilliant economists who were recruited to the planning commission. They worked out worked out 5-year plans. The second 5-year plan, which is very crucial, it set the structure of structure of economic. It cast the frame in which our the economic development of the country will proceed for the next 4 decades. The next, throughout the 20th century. What this plan, the second 5-year plan did was to prioritize industrialization. That is, the notion was that India was poor. India was poor because the British had, drained the country's economy, and not just the country's economy of its resources. It had drained the potential for the economy to grow at a fast, rapid pace by the kind of structures, whether it's in agriculture or in industry, it left behind. That that is a subject for another subsequent talk, later. Now, industry, the planners thought that India was not industrialized enough, and this is the time for us to invest in industries. And that too, that is that they decided to prioritize industries, investment in industries rather than in agriculture. Although agriculture was stagnant, the idea was that we should first prioritize industrialization, in investment in industries, and that too heavy industries. Heavy industries, that is big industries. They're like steel, iron and steel, like mines, all right, like machine tools, like power, machines to generate power, and so on. The idea was that if you invest first, you can also invest in producing cotton textiles by importing machines, or you can you can invest in various consumer goods industries, but like making cars and all that. But the idea was that if we invest in these industries, the rate of we will not build the potential of the economy to for rapid economic growth, because we will always have to be dependent on other countries for the machines to produce the machines that are involved in making refrigerators and other things. So they placed emphasis on heavy industries. Of course, till the heavy industries actually start working, they thought that will take the gestation period of these heavy industries will be long, for about 5 years or 6 years. But once if we sort of somehow tighten our belts for the next 5-6 years, all right, then once these industries start operating, then we will have very rapid economic growth. This was the idea, all right. And because these heavy industries involve huge amounts of capital, they felt that if we allow the private sector to to run these industries, private enterprises, they will become very powerful. This is against, they will become rich, very rich and very powerful they can also influence policy decisions. So the idea was that these industries, these big industries, should be in the hands of the government. And not only that, the government, so they emphasize the importance of public sector units, all right. And of course they allowed the operation of private sector, private enterprises, but these private enterprises can work in the consuming, to produce consumers' goods and so on, so that people will get their requirements of consumer goods, and as and when they consumer goods. But in this private sector, this is the way. The idea was to make the public sector most powerful. In fact, the government established, it proposed and it made sure that the commanding heights of the economy will be with the government, in the public sector. That's the commanding heights of the economy will be dominated by the public sector units. Along with it, the government introduced a system of licenses and controls. The government wanted to discourage people from importing expensive, television sets, importing, refrigerators, air conditioners, automobiles from abroad, because it's wasteful. We had very little foreign exchange. It's wasteful expenditure of foreign exchange. Whatever foreign exchange we have, we should spend on useful, on the more vital things like essential items, essential imports, like for instance machinery, essential imports like some chemicals and so on. So the government imposed increased tariffs, that is import duties it increased, and it also wanted to control the flow of private investment in various sectors of the economy, in various sectors of the industrial economy. So the government insisted that before any private individual can set up an industrial unit, he or she has to take permission from the government. Because once you are setting up industries, you will require import requirements. If you have to import machinery, you have to import raw materials. All these things. In order to import them, you'll have to have, you should not waste foreign exchange, all right. So you should, in private investors have to take permission from the government, if they want to import, they should get permits, all right. And the government would, would examine. There is a Directorate General of Technical Development which will examine whether this particular investment, they'll go into the drawings, read the drawings and say whether it is necessary at all for this private entrepreneur to invest, to set up this particular industrial unit. So this means at every step the private entrepreneurs had to take permission from the government. That's why Rajagopalachari, who was also part of the party, he fell out of the government. He fell out with Nehru on this issue. He described this socialist policy, as creating a license and permit Raj. License and permit Raj. Right? That's what he said it was creating, the government has created. This was in the case of, in the context of industry. What did the government do in the context of agriculture? Of course, for increasing agricultural, the increasing irrigation potential, the government invested in building huge dams, Bakranangal, Hirakud Dam and all that. Of course, the government also, built, now it's a part of history, Bhilai and Rourkela steel plants and so on. And you all know that Nehru made one comment when he was inaugurating the Hirakud Dam, that these dams and these steel mills are the temples of modern India, he declared. So anyway, now coming to agriculture, they provided this thing, they provided, made provision for building huge irrigation dams, and irrigation, once you build dams across rivers, you also want to make sure that the water reaches the fields. So it was essential for the government also to construct canals and all that. And apart from that, in agriculture, there was this problem of increasing productivity. As you all know, in agriculture, we, especially Indian agriculture, with its law of inheritance, which distributes, till recently, this law of inheritance applied only to Hindu law of inheritance, I am referring to, only applied to male sons, the sons of the family. Now it has been extended to the daughters also. Each son gets an equal share of the grandfather's property, all right. So anyway, the point is, because of this law of inheritance, the agricultural land holdings, all right, tend to get parceled into smaller and smaller units, over generations. They become very small units. So the governments, the planners thought the best way of increasing, increasing agricultural output during the 50s, all right, and early 60s, during the 50s, the idea was that in order to increase productivity of the soil in agriculture, you have to do large scale farming. It requires tractors, it requires combine harvesters and all that. Then you can increase your productivity. So in order to do this, they thought that we should, they can establish cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives and cooperative banks and so on. And then along with it, the Congress party had promised land to the tiller, because in Indian agriculture, in the pre-independence era, especially in North India, there was zamindari system, and the tiller, that is a cultivator or even the tenant who worked on land, did not get his share, what was due to him. Therefore, he was not interested in increasing agricultural, productivity. So because the lion's share went to the landlord or the zamindar. In order to, sort of give incentives to the peasant, the government decided to have extensive land reforms. But land is a state subject in our constitution. Anyway, the Congress party, which was the one party, that is a one party system, Congress party was dominant. So in all the state governments over time introduced land reforms. Land reforms meant reforms of, basically reforms of this thing, basically land reforms involved the following. The tenants got empowered, because tenants, especially of absentee landlords, were able to get land to cultivate. That is, the absentee landlords were absentee landlordism was abolished, and tenants, the former tenants, became landowners. I think they became they were small and medium peasants, and I think they became very significant in Indian subsequent in Indian democratic process, because they became the leaders they became new political leaders. They emerged as new political leaders, from different parts of the country, and also they belonged to they became the new dominant castes, and in whom power decided at the local levels. So this is the land reforms was a partial success because it eliminated absentee landlords who were not located in the village and actually supervising the agricultural work, but they were in the cities, and they used to only come to the village to collect their portion of the rent. All right. So this abolition of intermediaries was a big success, and along with it, there was also the government land reforms included the program of imposing land ceilings on land holdings, so that large land holdings will get the larger land holdings. If a person has more than say 12 acres of land, the excess land can be taken away from the landowner, for a nominal compensation, and that land above the ceiling level can be taken over by the government and can be redistributed to the landless. This ceiling redistribution of land was not very successful. Anyway, so this was the package of economic policies unfolded by the government to effect socialism. So to change the society, to mold the society along socialist lines, but there was in the 1960s, the country faced a big crisis. In 1962, there was Chinese aggression, and then there were two severe droughts. Agriculture. India had a deficit of food grains. There was not adequate food available, and in 1965, India was so short of food grains that it had to depend on the supply of PL 480 under the PL 480 program of the United States government. They would ship to India their excess wheat, which they used to dump in the ocean, and this used to be brought to India, and India had to give to the US government the price of this wheat in money terms, which the United States government kept in India to spend on the projects that it chose, it thought was important to it. Be that as it may, so there was an acute food shortage because of this policy. Now, what I am trying to point out to you, this is one example of how the emphasis on equality, sort of moderated growth. In fact, people used to mockingly say that Indian planning has achieved the Hindu rate of growth. It's a very offensive term now, Hindu rate of growth, because if our population was growing at the rate of 2% per year, all right, our economy was growing at the rate of 3% per year. All right. So that means, all right, the actual growth rate of the Indian economy was only 1%. It was too slow to ensure equality. In fact, as I will be discussing, the license permit Raj only ensured that monopolists thrive. Monopolists became more and more the license and permit Raj ensured that the big business became even bigger. They became more wealth was got concentrated in their hands, because it was the big business houses which were able to lobby with the government officials to get the licenses. And you know what happened, that once you get the license, this also created a rentier economy where you don't have to produce anything. Many of the people who managed to lobby with the government officials and get the licenses, the licenses were so much in demand in the market that they can sell these licenses without producing it at a high premium and make extra money just because they had these licenses. It's just like scooters, during those socialist days, scooters, there were only two companies which were producing scooters, and the company that was producing scooters, there was such a big demand for scooters, you had to wait for nearly 5 years to get your turn. You had to register for a scooter, and then you have to wait for nearly 5 years to get to buy your scooter. If the scooter costs about 7,000 rupees in the market, if you get the license, to buy the scooter, when you get your quota, you can sell the quota in the market for 16,000 rupees if the price of scooter is 8,000. So this means you can make, you can earn unearned income without paying anything extra, without making any, making any effort to increase production. So this way, that this socialist pattern of society created a rentier economy. It also made sure that actually the rich got richer and the poor got poorer by this type of socialist planning. Of course, so this is a clear-cut example of how equity considerations slowed down economic growth, economic development. Now, but this does not mean that equity but at the same time, I would like to point out that equality also contributed to our nation building efforts, especially when equality considerations, when the reservations, politics of reservations gained vigor. As we all know, Ambedkar introduced reservations for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and it was part of the constitution. And there is also a provision that reservations can be introduced for the backward castes, backward classes, which are called OBCs now, or other backward castes. There is this provision, and this reservations policy, I will also point out how this reservation policy had an impact on economic growth, economic development. But I should, at the same time, I should mention reservations policy was also contributed to national integration. Right? How? Especially reservations policy contributed to national integration this way. The reservation policies, this is reservation policies became vigorous in the ever since the 80s, and it attained a peak in 1989. It became soon after when Chaudhry Charan Singh became the Prime Minister. He set up a commission called the Mandal Commission to go into the possibility of providing reservations for the OBCs. Of course, the Mandal Commission came out with a report which the subsequent Indira Gandhi government shelved, and it took time. Only when VP Singh became the Prime Minister, this report was taken out, and the Mandal Commission recommendations were implemented at the central government level. You see, even as I am saying this, although the reservations for OBCs were not there at this, for the posts and seats in central government institutions, the policy of reservation policy for the OBCs had already been introduced in the states of South India, and it was, in fact, reservations policy, the history of reservations policy in South India goes back to 1911. Even during the British period, the reservations had been introduced because the depressed castes, and the backward castes, they used to be called depressed castes, were agitated. That this was called also the anti-Brahmin movement, agitated with the then government to grant reservations for them, because Brahmins, were overwhelmingly dominating in seats of power and in educational institutions. One thing we should remember when we are discussing the Muslim community, discussing the economic prospects as well as the social and economic conditions of the Muslim community, is that it's also internally diverse. It's also internally differentiated according to along caste lines, and there are extremely depressed Muslim communities as well. A case can be made for their inclusion in the reservations list. Definitely, a case can be made for these subcastes inclusion. In fact, if when we talk about it, we realize that when we compare the overall Indian situation, in the overall situation of Muslims in India, with the situation of Muslims in the southern states, you will find there's an enormous difference, because in the southern states, as I had mentioned earlier too, they have been entitled to reservations for the backward OBC reservations, and the results are there to see. They have made spectacular progress in very many public institutes, in securing jobs in various government offices, in private enterprises, in engineering colleges, medical colleges, and so on. It's in fact it's remarkable progress. So I think one case can be made not for the weaker diversity, but for the stronger reservations for these particularly vulnerable Muslim castes. That I should stress here. Having done that, I should also point out here that in spite of everything, there are remarkable instances of an aspirational class, a modernized aspirational class, joining the mainstream of economic life. There are several instances of Muslim young men and women from Muslim communities, from deprived Muslim community backgrounds, having achieved remarkable success, whether it's in the field of law or whether it's in the field of management or becoming airline pilots and so on. So there is, in spite of not being treated as special, not being treated with special privileges, there are very many instances of Muslim youth forging ahead. And I think it's important that these creamy layer should be expanded in the creamy layer among the Muslims should be expanded, and I think this will make for greater national integration. Definitely it will make for greater national integration, and I think there is a strong case can also be made out for opening opportunities, especially because Muslim communities are get isolated for a variety of reasons from the mainstream social life. Extra efforts have to be made, I think, through the internet and electronic media. I think it's possible for us today to reach Muslim women and make them access educational opportunities. In this context, I want to say that in some of the southern states, both in the present day Tamil Nadu and in the present day Karnataka, the government took a policy decision to promote education among women. They used to, and women were, Hindu women were also cloistered in their homes. The government made special efforts to reach, provide them extra facilities to, while sitting at home, while being at home, studying, and passing examinations and so on. So it's possible, and once you do it, once these women who are given these facilities, they were able to become graduates and take up government jobs and so on. So this is one way by which the immune women who are confined to intramural settings can be brought out to public life and participate equally with others in the act of nation building.